From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The plea deal for Hunter Biden falls apart in a federal courtroom as federal judge Mary Ellen Noreika asks inconvenient questions that embarrass the prosecution. What does this mean for the charges against President Biden's son and perhaps for the investigation into President Biden? Welcome to Potomac Watch. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and joining me today are Bill McGurn and Kim Strassel, both of whom have been following the Hunter Biden prosecution closely. Just to remind listeners, the deal that Hunter Biden's lawyers struck with federal prosecutors involved pleading guilty to 2 misdemeanor tax charges that would likely involve no prison time, and pleading guilty to a gun charge, but with a diversion agreement that the charge would be dropped if Hunter adhered to certain behavior. The deal has been heavily criticized as a wrist slap, and 2 IRS agents who investigated the case say they were prevented from fully looking into the money that came from foreign entities to Hunter, among other things, and they had recommended felony tax charges, but none of that was expected to upset the plea deal, and yet that's exactly what happened. Bill, what happened in court Wednesday?
What happened is that the plea deal imploded. The judge didn't throw it out, but when she asked some basic questions, for example, would Hunter Biden still be open to prosecution under laws like the FARA Act, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and the Justice Department said yes, then the defense guy said, no, that's not our understanding. If it is, we don't have a deal. They tried to reconstitute a deal, but they weren't able to agree. So the judge put it off for about a month to hear what their further briefings say, if they come up with a new deal or at least a better defined one and one that's justified.
Well, this is fascinating, Kim, because, how often does it happen that a plea deal falls apart because the two sides don't have the common understanding about it? Certainly, if you're Hunter Biden, you're not going to agree to a plea deal that is so narrow that it leaves you vulnerable to prosecution on other charges.
Yeah, this exposed the fiction of this deal, right? We were told when it came out this was straightforward, simple, easy, happens all the time. Instead, we go into this courtroom. The judge notes that all of these provisions are what she called atypical, potentially unconstitutional, without any real legal precedent. And then she asks the central question, which no lawyer would ever allow their client to walk into a courtroom without having the answer to, which was, is Hunter still potentially on the hook for future charges? And as you said, what lawyer would allow their client to sign a plea deal, give away any leverage that they might have with the risk of even more serious charges yet to come? Now, clearly, I think what happened here is that this exposed essentially a wink-nod deal between the prosecutors and Hunter Biden's team. Even though David Weiss has publicly says, our investigation is ongoing, which is convenient for a number of reasons, they had clearly intimated or somehow led Hunter Biden's team to believe that in fact the probe was over, except for the fine print. And the judge's insistence on some legal clarity on this issue exposed that wink-nod deal. And I think Hunter team's surprise in the courtroom was legitimate, that this was not what their understanding of this was. And it's just the latest example, I think, of David Weiss's office playing fast and loose with the details of this case.
David Weiss being the U.S. attorney who was leading the prosecution into the investigation and prosecution into Hunter Biden. Bill, why do you think the prosecution acknowledged in court or said in court that Hunter Biden would be open to further charges? Is it because that would have contradicted what Weiss and others had said previously? Because remember, when the plea deal was struck, the prosecution was saying, well, it's not over, so don't criticize this as being a sweetheart deal. There could still be other things. So they almost had to acknowledge that, I guess.
Exactly. They had to, because David Weiss has forever been saying he can't answer Congress's questions because there's an ongoing investigation. And because the plea was so generous, they had to say, no, the other stuff is still on the table. So they were forced into it, I think, not just by Hunter's case, but by the whole Justice Department effort to not give the American people answers about what they're doing and why. They were kind of backed into it. I agree with Kim. They might not have said it explicitly, but I think it was a wink and a nod to the Biden defense team that this is it. Hunter has nothing to worry about. But when they were called on it and forced to state their position for the public, of course, they had to deny that and say they could still be charged.
So where does this go from here? I mean, 30 days the judge has given them to work out something on this plea deal. I suppose one possible outcome, Kim, would be that the two sides come together and the Justice Department does say, in fact, we're not going to charge Hunter on FARA charges, that is the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Now, that's a law that requires people who represent a foreign government to register with the United States government. And it has rarely been prosecuted, but was notably prosecuted against Paul Manafort by Robert Mueller and his team, the special prosecutor who went after Donald Trump on the Russia collusion investigation. And by those standards that the Manafort prosecution set, Hunter Biden might be vulnerable to a FARA prosecution. Now, I suppose prosecutors could take that off the table in a new plea deal, although that would subject them to even more criticism that this was a sweetheart deal.
It would subject them to more criticism. It would also essentially mean that the probe is over, which would remove from the Department of Justice this shield that's been so convenient to them as House Republicans dig into this. By saying that this is an ongoing investigation, they don't have to answer those questions. And I would note too, Paul, that they'd probably have to be more sweeping and indeed say that the entire probe was closed, because while that was the particular provision that the judge asked about, when you listen to these IRS whistleblowers, they intimated that there were a lot of other areas that the team was looking at and had looked at as well, too. Questions of bribery charges, money laundering charges. We don't know the details of that, but essentially the Department of Justice would have to say, entire investigation is done. The other problem I would just note about coming to a resolution on this plea deal is I mentioned that the judge had said that all of this was atypical. And one of the things that this deal contained was a provision saying that if Hunter Biden remained clear of drug use and gun possession over the next couple of years, that these charges for the gun ownership would be dropped. But they had a special clause in there saying that it was up to the judge to decide whether or not he maintained good behavior, which is very rare. It's supposed to be the Department of Justice. This was a special little perk that Hunter's team negotiated because they were worried that if you had a future Republican Department of Justice, that maybe they would have a different definition of what's good behavior or not. And so they wanted to leave it to the judge. That's where the judge said that this was potentially unconstitutional because it was putting her in the role of being a prosecutor. I don't know how they necessarily resolve that in a way that Hunter's team would feel comfortable with.
And Hunter's team is worried because if President Biden would lose re-election to a Republican, the plea deal terms on the gun charge extend into the next administration. Is that correct?
Yes, that is their concern. Now, look, lots of defendants have to accept that a future Department of Justice may change hands and you may get somebody looking at it that has a different view of this. So they were essentially negotiating a little special carve out to give themselves some immunity by essentially letting the judge make the call. The judge does not seem willing to go down that road. So that's another issue that has to be sorted.
Hunter Biden, of course, pleaded not guilty after the plea deal fell apart. Bill, where do you think this plea deal goes from here? Do you think it'll be reconstituted?
Well, I think it has to be. I don't think the judge is going to sign it. And it's a real problem. Hunter Biden has temporarily pleaded not guilty to the two tax charges. Remember, he wasn't charged with the gun deal. It was a curious arrangement where he agreed to a diversion program. So there's so many questions. From what I understand, when Justice Department guys make a deal, they require you to plead guilty to like the most serious charge. And on a lot of these serious charges, Hunter Biden, like the gun charge, could get jail time, significant. So I don't think it's going to hold up to any scrutiny. And I don't know what they're going to do. I think their bigger fear is that so far, Very few publications have pursued this and pursued the president's obviously false statements that the family never got a dime from China and he knew nothing about his son's business. I mean, with all the testimony, that's becoming harder and harder to sustain. And I think harder and harder for the press to ignore. So I think this was a watershed moment in this scandal because for most of the time, it's only been a few people following it. And now I think it's going to be very hard to ignore the president's obvious untruthfulness on many occasions when asked about his son. I mean, yesterday, after the hearing, Karine Jean-Pierre said Hunter is a private citizen and this is a personal matter. And it's not a personal matter. The question is involving the president. What was he selling? What did the president know? It's a public matter with public interest. I don't know how long she can sustain that line.